The early morning sun filtered through the glass facade of Central City Bank, casting long, angular shadows on the marble floor. Inside, the bank was already humming with activity, customers bustling, employees moving swiftly behind counters, the crisp, quiet clicking of keyboards blending with the soft murmur of transactions being processed. Everything about the bank screamed luxury and precision, from the minimalist decor to the designer outfits worn by the staff. It was the kind of place that catered to the city's elite people with money, power, and influence. Standing just beyond the bank's massive double doors, Leela Stewart paused, taking in her surroundings with a careful, calculated glance. Unlike the average visitor to Central City Bank, Leela didn't project wealth through extravagant jewelry or designer bags. Her look was more understated: a sleek black dress, elegant in its simplicity, a neutral-toned coat draped over her arm, and a pair of low-profile leather flats. Her most striking feature wasn't her appearance, but her presence, the kind that made people turn their heads in silent curiosity. There was something in the way she moved, with quiet confidence, a force that was hard to ignore. But Leela wasn't here for the usual financial business that brought in the city's wealthiest. Today, her visit had a far more serious, covert objective. She wasn't just another high-net-worth client coming to check on her accounts or discuss the terms of a new investment. Leela was here for something much bigger, much more dangerous. As she crossed the threshold of the bank, she felt the familiar sensation of eyes flicking toward her, observing her with a mix of curiosity and, from some, suspicion. Greg Maddox, the head of the bank's security, was one of those people. Positioned near the entrance, Maddox watched every person who entered with hawkish intensity, but his gaze lingered a little longer than usual on Leela. It wasn't her fault, no. She couldn't help the assumptions that people like Maddox made the moment they laid eyes on her. Greg Maddox had been with the bank for nearly 5 years. A former police officer who had left the force under less than honorable circumstances, he now used his security expertise to guard places like this, places full of people he deemed worthy of respect. And to Maddox, Leela didn't quite fit that description. She was too unassuming for his liking, too quiet. In his mind, anyone who wasn't ostentatiously flaunting their wealth in this environment was immediately suspect. His eyes narrowed as Leela approached the front desk, his fingers twitching as if ready to reach for his radio at any moment. "Another one of them," he muttered under his breath, eyes narrowing. Maddox didn't like the way she carried herself, the confidence with which she moved through the world, as if she owned it. People like her were always a problem, always causing trouble in places where they didn't belong. He'd seen it before: well-dressed con artists, people who thought they could game the system, walking into high-end establishments like this and pretending they were part of the elite. And Maddox was determined to make sure that didn't happen today. As Leela approached the main teller, she took a deep breath, calming the nerves fluttering in her chest. On the outside, she was composed, unshaken by the uncomfortable stares from the bank's patrons and staff alike. But inside, her mind was buzzing with the enormity of what she was about to do. Today was not just about completing a financial transaction, it was about sealing a deal that would fundamentally shift power in a sector already riddled with corruption. Her target wasn't just a number on a balance sheet, it was an entire network of illegal activities that extended far beyond the marble floors of this bank. "Good morning. How may we assist you today?" The teller's voice was polite but laced with an edge of suspicion. Leela gave a brief smile, handing over her identification and documents. "I'd like to finalize a transaction. I believe everything should already be in order." Her tone was steady, professional. She had rehearsed this in her head a dozen times. There was no room for error. The teller looked over the documents, nodding slowly, but his fingers hesitated on the keyboard as he glanced at the information. His gaze shifted toward the security desk where Maddox was still watching, and it was clear that something was off. The air in the room shifted, a tension building silently as Maddox crossed the floor toward the front desk. "Is there a problem?" Leela's voice was calm, but the slight furrow in her brow showed she was aware of the shifting dynamics. Before the teller could respond, Maddox stepped in front of him, cutting him off. "Excuse me, ma'am," Maddox said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Would you mind telling me what business brings you here today?" Leela blinked once, meeting his gaze directly. She could see the hostility in his eyes, the underlying aggression masked by the thin veneer of professional courtesy. "I'm here for a transaction," she repeated. "Is there a problem with that?" Maddox glanced at the teller, who was shifting uncomfortably behind the counter. "It's just that we don't often see people like you handling this kind of business." His words were deliberately vague, but the implication was crystal clear. Leela felt her stomach tighten. She'd prepared for this. Of course she had. Leela had spent her entire life preparing for moments like this, when men like Maddox would try to question her legitimacy, her right to be in certain spaces, to conduct certain kinds of business. But today was not the day for confrontations. Leela forced herself to relax, giving him a curt nod. "I assure you, everything is in order. If there's an issue, I'd be happy to resolve it." Maddox wasn't satisfied with her answer. He could feel the challenge in her words, even though she said them with complete calm. Something about this woman, about her confidence, irritated him deeply. "You don't mind if we do a quick background check, do you?" "Standard protocol, of course," he said, but it wasn't a question. He was already motioning to one of the other security officers to come over. "Standard protocol?" Leela asked, arching an eyebrow. "Is that something you do for all your clients?" Maddox gave a thin smile. "Only the ones who raise certain flags." Leila's gaze hardened just slightly, but she kept her composure. "I see." The tension in the bank was palpable now. Leela could feel the eyes on her, the whispering murmurs from nearby clients who had noticed the altercation. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself for what was about to happen. Maddox wasn't going to let this go. He was a man with something to prove, and she was his target. What he didn't know was that she wasn't a target. She was a predator. And today, Maddox had just stepped into her trap. The air inside Central Citibank had thickened, tension swirling between the marble pillars and glass panels like an invisible storm ready to erupt. Leela could feel the weight of eyes on her, the employees, the security team, even the other customers, all now tuned into the interaction between her and Greg Maddox. She had dealt with men like him before, authoritative, determined to exercise their power over anyone they deemed inferior or out of place. Maddox wasn't the first, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. But today, Leela wasn't in the mood for games. "Let's not make this difficult," Ma'am Maddox said, his voice losing any pretense of politeness. He leaned slightly forward, signaling with his posture that he wasn't planning to back down. "Step aside, please, so we can run a quick background check. After that, you're free to go about your business." Leela didn't flinch, but internally she noted the shift in his tone, the way he had moved from faux civility to outright command. She knew that Maddox was trying to provoke her into something rash, something that would justify the way he was escalating the situation. But if there was one thing Leela Stewart had learned over the years, it was patience. She had dealt with boardrooms full of men who had tried the same tactic, each believing they could corner her, intimidate her, make her second-guess herself. She'd never let them win. She wouldn't let Maddox win either. I don't see why this is necessary," Leela replied calmly, standing her ground without raising her voice. "Everything is in order." I've presented all the required documentation, and if there's an issue, I'm sure we can resolve it through the appropriate channels." Maddox smirked. It was the kind of smirk that dripped with arrogance, the type that told you he had already made up his mind about you before you'd even said a word. "You might think everything is in order, but I have my doubts. And when I have doubts, I investigate. Standard procedure, you know." Leela maintained eye contact, her expression neutral. "You seem quite confident about your doubts, Officer Maddox." Maddox bristled at her use of his last name, as though she were challenging his authority. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like her. "It's my job to be thorough, ma'am. Some of us take security seriously." Leela glanced around, noting how several of the other security officers had subtly positioned themselves around the lobby, likely on Maddox's orders. The entire operation was becoming less about protocol and more about spectacle. Maddox wasn't just questioning her, he was trying to make an example of her. The bank teller, still standing awkwardly behind the counter, cleared his throat nervously. "Officer Maddox, I've looked over the documents and they seem—" "Stay out of this," Maddox snapped at the teller, cutting him off. The younger man flushed and quickly averted his eyes, retreating a step as Maddox's cold gaze returned to Leela. For a brief moment, Leela considered playing along, letting Maddox run his little background check just to get it over with. But then she realized what he was trying to do. This wasn't just about one check. This was about undermining her authority, about stripping her of her dignity, and making her appear as though she were the one in the wrong. It wasn't about procedure or security, it was about power. And Leela Stewart did not lose power. She stood a little straighter, drawing herself up to her full height and meeting Maddox's gaze head-on. "I know exactly what this is about," she said, her voice cool and measured. "You're looking for a reason to discredit me, to make this transaction seem suspicious because, in your mind, I don't fit your idea of who should be conducting business here." Maddox raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering for just a second. "What's that supposed to mean?" Leela didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the silence hang between them for a few moments, forcing Maddox to wait. She could see the frustration building behind his calm facade, the slight twitch of his jaw, as he realized she wasn't going to be intimidated. "What it means," she said finally, "is that you've made up your mind about me before you even looked at the documents. And now, you're trying to justify that bias with this so-called investigation." The words hit their mark. Maddox's smirk vanished entirely, replaced with a thin-lipped frown. "I suggest you cooperate, ma'am. Things will go a lot smoother for you if you do." Leela tilted her head slightly, her expression softening, almost as if she were considering his words. Then, she smiled a small, controlled smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Officer Maddox," she began, her voice even quieter now, forcing him to lean in just a little closer to hear her. "I've dealt with men like you my entire life. You think you can intimidate me, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. You're making a mistake, a very big mistake. And when this is over, you'll be the one explaining yourself." For a second, there was silence. Maddox stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, his frown deepened into a scowl. "Is that a threat?" Leila's smile didn't falter. "No, it's a promise." Maddox's hand twitched toward his radio, his face reddening as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Leela. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the doors of the bank swung open with a sharp hiss, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. 2 men and a woman entered, all dressed in sleek, tailored suits. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the room as they approached the front desk. Leela recognized them immediately, her legal team. She had summoned them with a single, silent text the moment Maddox had begun escalating the situation. Maddox watched them warily as they approached, his eyes narrowing. "And who are they?" he demanded, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. The lead lawyer, Nathaniel Clark, stopped in front of Maddox, his face impassive. "We're MS, Stewart's legal representatives," he said calmly, handing Maddox a card, "and we're here to ensure that her rights are respected during this conversation." Maddox snatched the card from Nathaniel's hand, glaring at him. "This isn't a legal matter," he growled. "It's a security check. Your client is cooperating with our procedures, as is standard protocol." "Standard protocol doesn't involve racial profiling or harassment," Nathaniel replied smoothly, not missing a beat. "And from what I've observed, that's exactly what's happening here." Maddox's face flushed deeper. "This is not profiling," he snapped. "I'm just doing my job." "Then do your job properly," Nathaniel said, his voice turning sharp. "You have no grounds to detain or investigate my client. Everything is in order, and unless you can produce actual evidence of wrongdoing, I suggest you let her complete her business without further interference." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Maddox's hand hovered near his radio again, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next move. He had started this, certain that he could control the situation, but now it was spiraling out of his grasp. Leela remained silent, standing just behind Nathaniel, watching the confrontation unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Maddox had dug his own grave, and now it was only a matter of time before he fell into it. "I'll need a moment," Maddox finally said, his voice tight with anger. "I'm not done here." Nathaniel didn't flinch. "Take all the time you need. Just know that every second you continue this baseless investigation, you're digging yourself into a deeper legal hole." Maddox glared at him for another few seconds, then turned abruptly, stalking off toward the back office to consult with his superior. As he disappeared from view, Leela exhaled slowly, allowing herself a moment of relief. She knew this wasn't over yet. Maddox wasn't the type to back down easily, but at least now the power dynamic had shifted. Her legal team had arrived, and with them, the tide was beginning to turn in her favor. The oppressive weight of the tension in Central City Bank seemed to thicken as the minutes stretched into an uneasy silence. Leela could sense the eyes of everyone in the room: security, bank employees, even the customers who had been quietly observing the drama unfold from a distance fixed on her. She had faced situations like this before, moments where authority figures tried to exert their power to keep her in line, but never with this much public scrutiny. The air was electric, crackling with the unspoken question: what happens next? In the back office, Greg Maddox was fuming. He'd slammed the door shut behind him as he stormed inside, glaring at the bank's internal security screens that showed Leela calmly standing near the front desk, surrounded by her legal team. His mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. He had expected her to buckle, to quietly cooperate once he brought up the background check, but instead, she'd turned the tables on him, summoning a high-powered legal team like she had predicted his every move. Maddox couldn't shake the sense that something was very, very wrong here. He was the one in control. He was supposed to be the one calling the shots. Yet somehow, with just a few carefully chosen words and the arrival of her legal counsel, Leela had managed to shift the entire dynamic. Now it was his position that felt precarious, and it was his authority that was being questioned. For a moment, he glanced at his own reflection in the window of the office, the city skyline faintly visible in the background. His jaw was clenched so tightly that his teeth hurt. He had built his career on being the one in charge, the one who never let anyone, especially someone like her, slip through the cracks. He wasn't about to let that change today. As Maddox turned back to the bank's security cameras, a soft knock echoed against the door. The bank manager, Patrick Sullivan, entered hesitantly, adjusting his tie nervously. He had heard enough from the hallway to realize that things were escalating far beyond a simple security check. Greg Sullivan began, his voice measured but clearly uneasy. "What's going on out there? This doesn't look like standard protocol anymore." Maddox turned toward him, his expression hard. "It's under control," he snapped, although his voice was a little too sharp to be convincing. "She's hiding something, Sullivan. I can feel it. There's something off about her, and I'm not letting her walk out of here until I find out what." Sullivan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the screen showing Leela's composed demeanor. "Look, Greg, I understand you're doing your job, but she's got a team of lawyers with her now. High-profile lawyers. This isn't some petty situation anymore. If we don't tread carefully, this could blow up in ways we don't want." Maddox narrowed his eyes. "So what? We just let her walk out of here. You really want to risk her pulling something over on us? Because I'm telling you, that's exactly what's happening. She's too calm, too confident. It doesn't add up." Sullivan hesitated, torn between his instincts to de-escalate the situation and Maddox's relentless conviction. "I'm just saying we need to be smart about this. The legal team. They'll tear us apart if we don't have solid ground to stand on. If we're wrong, the bank could be facing a serious lawsuit. This is no joke." Maddox crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. "I'm not wrong." The statement was final, resolute, spoken like a man who had long since convinced himself that his gut feeling was always right. "I'll get the proof. But I'm not backing down now." Sullivan sighed but nodded, realizing that Maddox wasn't going to be swayed by logic or caution. As the manager left the room, Maddox returned to the screens, his mind churning with how to move forward. He wasn't about to let some corporate lawyer and a smooth-talking billionaire make a fool of him. Back in the main lobby, Leela's legal team was in the process of preparing documents, quietly consulting with each other. Nathaniel Clark, her lead attorney, maintained his calm demeanor, but Leela could see the glint of anticipation in his eyes. Clark thrived in situations like this, public, high-stakes encounters where every word, every move, carried weight. He glanced at Leela, giving her a slight nod, a silent signal that everything was going according to plan. Leela acknowledged it with the barest hint of a smile. She trusted Clark, but she also knew Maddox wasn't going to give up that easily. "How long do you think it will take for him to crack?" Leela asked quietly, her tone casual, as if she were discussing a lunch order, not a brewing legal storm. Clark glanced toward the back office, where Maddox had disappeared moments earlier. "Not long," he replied. "Men like him don't handle pressure well, especially when they're backed into a corner. He'll make a mistake soon enough." Leela nodded, satisfied. "Good. I want him to make that mistake." Meanwhile, outside the bank, the sun had begun to rise higher, casting a harsh light through the glass entrance. A few customers had left the building, but most stayed, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Word had spread among the employees as well. The entire staff was on edge, whispering about the woman with the legal team and the tense exchange with Maddox. Suddenly, the silence was broken as the door to the back office swung open and Maddox emerged, his face tight with controlled fury. He strode back toward Leela, his boots echoing off the polished floors, each step calculated and deliberate. The bank's employees seemed to instinctively move out of his way as he approached the front desk again, his eyes locking onto Leela. "MS," Stuart Maddox said, his voice clipped. "We've decided to proceed with further questioning. I'm not satisfied with the documentation you've provided, and until I am, we're going to conduct a more thorough investigation." Nathaniel Clark immediately stepped forward, his calm professionalism contrasting sharply with Maddox's aggression. "That's not going to happen," Clark said firmly. "You have no grounds for any further questioning. If you continue this baseless harassment, we will be filing an injunction against the bank and against you personally. The law is very clear here, Officer Maddox." Maddox's jaw clenched, the muscles twitching with barely contained frustration. "I'm not asking for your permission, Mr. Clark," he spat. "I'm telling you what's going to happen." Leela watched the exchange silently, her face an unreadable mask. She could feel Maddox's rage simmering just below the surface, his desire to assert his authority, despite knowing he was on shaky legal ground. It was only a matter of time before he made a critical error. That's what men like him always did when pushed to the edge they snapped. And Leela had every intention of pushing him further. "So what now?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm as she folded her arms across her chest. "You plan to detain me? Arrest me? What exactly do you think you're going to prove here, Maddox?" Her use of his last name without the formal title was deliberate, a small but calculated slight. It was a way of reminding him that she wasn't intimidated by his badge or his authority. Maddox's eyes narrowed, his face darkening with anger. "We'll see what you're hiding soon enough," he growled, stepping closer to her. "I'm not stupid. I know you're up to something, and I'm going to find out what it is." Nathaniel Clark took a step forward, his posture tense. "Officer Maddox, I strongly advise you to back off. Right now, you're crossing a line you won't be able to walk back from." But Maddox wasn't listening anymore. His focus was entirely on Leela, his gaze burning with the intensity of a man who had become fixated on his target. He was convinced that she was hiding something, and nothing, no amount of legal threats or reasoning was going to stop him from uncovering it. In his mind, this wasn't just about Leela anymore, it was about proving himself, about showing everyone that he was in control. "Turn over your bag," Maddox ordered, his hand outstretched. Leela didn't move. "You want my bag?" she asked softly, arching an eyebrow. "What exactly do you think you'll find in it?" Maddox sneered. "We'll find out when I look, won't we?" For the first time since the encounter had begun, Leela allowed herself a small, genuine smile, one that didn't bother to hide the amusement in her eyes. She slowly reached for her bag, holding it out toward Maddox with an almost mocking grace. "Go ahead," she said. "Open it." The tension in the air was so thick now that it was almost suffocating. Maddox took the bag from her, roughly yanking open the zipper as he began to rummage through it. Leela stood perfectly still, watching him with a calm detachment that only fueled his growing frustration. Maddox's hands moved frantically through the contents of the bag papers, a leather-bound notebook, a sleek tablet. His movements became more erratic as the seconds ticked by, and it became clear that he wasn't finding what he had expected. Finally, Maddox pulled out a stack of documents, flipping through them hastily. His frown deepened as he scanned the pages, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath. The documents were pristine, carefully organized legal papers that detailed a series of financial transactions between several international firms. But as Maddox read through them, he realized something was wrong, very wrong. The names, the dates, the companies involved. It didn't make sense. These weren't the documents he had been expecting. In fact, They didn't seem to implicate Leela in anything at all. Maddox's face twisted in frustration as he rifled through the rest of the bag, searching for anything that would justify his actions. But there was nothing. No incriminating evidence. No proof of wrongdoing. Nothing. Leela let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again, her voice soft but cutting. "Still think I'm hiding something, Officer Maddox?" Maddox's hands tightened around the documents, crumpling the edges in his grip. He had been so sure, so convinced that he was on the verge of uncovering some grand scheme. But now, standing here with nothing to show for it, he felt the crushing weight of defeat settling over him. His mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, an excuse for why he had come up empty-handed. But the truth was staring him in the face. He had been wrong. And worse, everyone in the bank had seen it. The atmosphere inside Central City Bank had shifted once again, but this time the weight of it felt heavier, more oppressive. The silence that followed Maddox's failed attempt to find anything incriminating in Leela's bag was deafening. It wasn't just a moment of embarrassment for him, it was a moment of public failure. His hands still gripped the edge of Leela's documents, but they now trembled slightly, betraying the boiling frustration beneath his forced composure. Leela watched him closely, reading every flicker of emotion that crossed his face. Maddox's confidence had cracked, and that crack was quickly widening. He had overplayed his hand, and now he was left standing in the middle of the bank lobby with nothing but his bruised ego and mounting anger. Leela could feel the shift in power, the way the energy of the room had moved back in her favor. She had been patient, knowing that men like Maddox inevitably made mistakes when they let their arrogance get the better of them. And now it was time to push him over the edge. "Are you satisfied now?" Officer Maddox, Leela asked quietly, her voice a razor-thin blade cutting through the thick air. Her words were calm, but the undertone of victory was unmistakable. She wanted him to feel it, that sting of humiliation, that recognition that he had lost control. Maddox's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he crumpled the papers in his hands. His pride was wounded, but more than that, his authority had been challenged in front of everyone. He had built his career on never backing down, on always being the one in control. And now, with all eyes on him, he was dangerously close to losing it. "This isn't over," Maddox growled, throwing the crumpled papers onto the desk in front of him. His voice, once sharp and commanding, now sounded strained, desperate to reclaim the power he had lost. "There's something you're hiding. I know it." Leela raised an eyebrow, her expression cool and collected. "You've searched my bag, gone through my documents, questioned me at length, and yet you found nothing. So, what exactly am I hiding, officer? Or is it just that you don't like the idea of being wrong?" The words hit Maddox hard, and the twitch in his jaw told her everything she needed to know. He was unraveling. It was a slow, painful process, but Leela had seen it happen before. How men like Maddox, so convinced of their own righteousness, couldn't handle being shown their own weaknesses. And now that he was on the defensive, every step he took would only dig him deeper into the hole he had created. Nathaniel Clark, who had been silently observing the entire exchange, took a step forward, his presence a steady anchor amidst the rising tension. "Officer Maddox," he began, his voice measured and professional, but with a firmness that left no room for debate. "I suggest you step back and reconsider your position here. You've made serious allegations against my client, none of which you've been able to substantiate. If you continue down this path, it won't just be a question of professional misconduct, it will be personal liability." Maddox's eyes flicked toward Clark, a flash of fury crossing his face. "I don't need a lawyer to tell me how to do my job," he spat. You think because you've got a suit and a law degree, you can walk in here and throw your weight around. Not in my bank. The words sounded hollow, even to Maddox himself. This wasn't about the law anymore, and he knew it. This was about ego, about the power dynamics he had so carefully constructed over the years, dynamics that Leela had just shattered. But Maddox wasn't the kind of man to back down, even when he knew he should. His entire career had been built on never conceding defeat, no matter the cost. And now, as his grip on control slipped through his fingers, he doubled down on his aggression. "I'm not done with you," Stuart Maddox growled, turning his attention back to Leela. "You think you can walk in here with your lawyers and your smug attitude and get away with whatever scam you're pulling? Think again. I know people like you, you're all the same. You think you can bend the rules, use your money and your connections to avoid consequences. Not this time." Leila's eyes narrowed slightly, her calm demeanor unwavering. "And what exactly do you think I've done, Maddox? You've yet to provide any evidence of wrongdoing. So far, the only person who's crossed any lines here is you." Maddox took a step forward, his body language shifting from professional to confrontational. His fists clenched at his sides, his frustration visibly bubbling over. "You don't belong here," he hissed. "You never did. You walk in here like you own the place, flashing your money around like it's supposed to mean something. But I know what you really are, a con artist, and I'm going to prove it." The silence that followed was thick with tension, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Maddox had crossed a line not just legally but personally. His words were no longer about security or protocol. They were about something deeper, something uglier: racial prejudice. "Prayer?" Leela didn't flinch, but the shift in her posture was subtle and unmistakable. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes hardened into something colder, more dangerous. Maddox had just made this personal in a way he couldn't take back. Nathaniel Clark, sensing the escalation, stepped in again, his voice more forceful this time. "Officer Maddox, you need to stop this. Right now." But Maddox wasn't listening. He was too far gone, too consumed by his need to reassert his authority. In his mind, this wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about winning. It was about proving that he was the one in control, that Leela couldn't just walk in here and make him look like a fool. "You want me to stop?" Maddox sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Fine. But I'm taking her with me. If she won't cooperate, then I'll take her down to the station, and we'll sort this out there." The room seemed to freeze. For a moment, it was as if everything stopped: the murmurs from the other customers, the quiet typing of the bank tellers, the distant hum of the air conditioning. All of it faded into a deafening silence as Maddox's words hung in the air. Leela didn't move. She didn't need to. The tension in her shoulders, the steely resolve in her gaze, said everything. But Nathaniel Clark was already moving. "That's enough," Clark snapped, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. "You've officially crossed the line, Officer Maddox. If you lay one finger on my client, you'll be facing a lawsuit so fast you won't know what hit you. This isn't just misconduct anymore, this is harassment, and it's illegal. You have no grounds to detain her, no probable cause, and no evidence. I'm warning you, back off." Maddox glared at Clark, his body coiled with tension, but for the first time there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He knew Clark was right. He had no legal grounds to take Leela into custody. But his pride, his stubborn refusal to admit defeat, kept him from backing down. Before Maddox could respond, the doors to the bank swung open again, and a new figure entered the scene: a man in his early 40s, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit. His presence commanded attention, and the moment he stepped inside, All eyes turned toward him. It was Victor Manning, the regional director of Central City Bank, and his arrival was unexpected. Maddox's eyes widened in surprise as Manning approached, his expression one of quiet authority. There was no need for grand gestures or raised voices. Manning carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who knew they were in charge. "What's going on here?" Manning asked, his voice low but firm as he looked between Maddox, Leela, and Nathaniel Clark. His eyes lingered on Maddox for a beat longer, silently assessing the situation. Maddox opened his mouth to respond, but Manning held up a hand, stopping him. "I don't need the whole story. I just want to know why this has escalated to the point where we're discussing detaining a client. Can someone explain that to me?" Nathaniel Clark spoke first, his tone measured but with a sharp edge. "Officer Maddox has been harassing my client without cause. She's provided all the necessary documentation, but he's refused to accept it. He's now threatening to detain her without any legal justification." Manning's eyes flicked back to Maddox, his expression unreadable. "Is this true, Maddox?" For a moment Maddox hesitated, his mouth working as if trying to find the right words. I'm following protocol," he finally said, though even to his own ears it sounded weak. "There were some inconsistencies in the documents, and Inconsistencies," Manning interrupted, his voice sharper now. "Or were you just looking for something that wasn't there?" Maddox bristled at the insinuation, his pride flaring again. "She's hiding something. I know it." Manning's gaze hardened. "What you know or don't know is irrelevant. What matters are the facts, and the fact is, you have no legal grounds to detain her. I'm putting an end to this right now. You've embarrassed yourself and this bank enough for one day." Maddox's face turned red, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment it looked like he was going to argue, to try and salvage what was left of his authority. But he was trapped. He had no evidence, no justification, and now even his superiors were against him. Leela remained silent, watching the scene unfold with a quiet satisfaction. Manning's arrival had been unexpected, but it was a welcome development. Maddox had dug himself into a hole, and now he was being buried in it. "This isn't over," Maddox muttered, his voice low and bitter as he glared at Leela one last time before turning on his heel and stalking out of the lobby. For a moment the silence returned, thick and heavy. Then, slowly, the tension in the room began to dissipate. Leela exhaled softly, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. She had won, but she knew this wasn't the end of the story. Maddox wasn't going to let this go easily. As Manning turned to address her, Leela met his gaze with a calm, steady expression. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Ms. Stewart," he said, his tone professional but with a hint of genuine regret. "This should never have happened." "You're right," Leela replied, her voice even. "It shouldn't have." Manning gave her a curt nod. "I'll make sure this is dealt with appropriately. Officer Maddox won't be bothering you again." Leela didn't respond immediately, letting the words hang in the air. She knew Manning meant well, but she also knew that this wasn't over. Maddox wasn't the type to let a defeat like this slide. He would come back, and when he did, he would be more dangerous than ever. But for now the battle had been won, and as Leela gathered her things and prepared to leave, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Maddox had been humbled, and the power dynamic had shifted back in her favor. But the war was far from over. As Leela walked out of Central City Bank that afternoon, her mind was already racing ahead, strategizing for what was to come. She had won the initial battle, but she knew better than anyone that men like Greg Maddox didn't give up easily. He was angry, humiliated, and most importantly, still convinced that he could take her down. His pride was on the line now, and that made him dangerous. Leela had spent enough time around men like him to know they wouldn't simply walk away from a challenge, especially when it struck at their authority. The late afternoon sun was just beginning to dip below the skyline, casting long shadows over the city streets as Leela stepped into her sleek black sedan. Her driver, Marcus, opened the door for her without a word, his eyes flicking briefly toward her, as if to ask if everything had gone according to plan. Leela gave him a brief nod of reassurance before sliding into the back seat, the leather seats cool against her skin. She knew that this momentary calm was nothing more than the eye of the storm. As the car pulled away from the bank, Leela took out her phone and typed a single message to Nathaniel Clark, "Be ready for the next move." She could feel it in her bones Maddox wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Meanwhile, back inside the bank, Maddox's fury simmered beneath the surface, his face flushed with the bitter taste of public humiliation. He stalked into the back office, slamming the door shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the thin walls. His hands shook as he paced the small, windowless room, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge, retribution, and how he had been made a fool in front of the entire bank. Maddox was a man who thrived on control. From his days as a police officer to his current position as head of security, he had always been the one pulling the strings, the one who could bend situations to his will. But Leela Stewart had managed to outmaneuver him at every turn, and that was something he simply couldn't accept. He glared at the security monitors in front of him, replaying the footage of the confrontation in the lobby. He watched as Leela calmly handed over her documents, as Nathaniel Clark stepped in with his legal threats, as Victor Manning arrived to shut him down. Each moment of the recording burned itself into Maddox's memory, fueling his already volcanic rage. He had been right. He knew he had been right. Leela Stewart wasn't just another wealthy client conducting legitimate business. There was something more, something beneath the surface that she was hiding. He was sure of it. And now, with his pride on the line, Maddox was more determined than ever to find out what it was. Reaching for his phone, Maddox dialed a number, his hands shaking slightly with the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The line rang twice before a voice on the other end picked up. "It's me," Maddox growled into the receiver. "We've got a situation." The voice on the other end, cold and professional, didn't ask for details. "What do you need?" "I need information," Maddox replied, his voice low and intense. "Everything you can find on a woman named Leela Stewart. Background, finances, business dealings, personal life, anything that looks even remotely suspicious. I want it on my desk by the end of the day." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a curt reply. "Consider it done." Maddox hung up, his chest heaving with barely controlled anger. He wasn't going to let Leela walk away from this. Not after what she had done to him. He would dig into her life, expose her for the fraud he knew she was, and bring her down once and for all. As he sat down at his desk, his mind began to churn with plans, ways to use whatever dirt he could find on Leela to his advantage. He had connections, powerful ones, from his days on the force, and he wasn't above using them to get what he wanted. If Leela Stewart thought this was over, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. Several hours later, as the evening began to settle over the city, Leela sat in her penthouse suite, high above the bustling streets. The room was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, the city skyline stretching out before her like a tapestry of glass and steel. She sipped her glass of wine thoughtfully, her eyes fixed on the horizon, but her mind was elsewhere. Nathaniel Clark had just finished briefing her on the situation at the bank. Victor Manning had assured them that Maddox would be dealt with internally, but both Leela and Clark knew that wasn't the end of it. Maddox was a man with too much ego, too much pride, and too much anger to simply walk away from a defeat like this. He would come for her. The question was when and how. "We need to be ready," Nathaniel said, leaning against the marble counter in her kitchen, his tone serious. "Maddox won't let this go. He's the kind of man who digs his heels in when he's been embarrassed. I wouldn't be surprised if he's already trying to find some way to retaliate." Leila nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "He'll come for me," she agreed. "But I'm not worried about him. I'm worried about who he'll bring with him." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "You think he'll escalate this?" "Men like Maddox always escalate," Leila replied. "He's not going to play by the rules. He'll go looking for dirt, and he'll use whatever he finds to try and destroy me. But he's going to find that I'm not as easy to take down as he thinks." Nathaniel smiled slightly, a glint of admiration in his eyes. "You're always 5 steps ahead, aren't you?" Leila didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her entire career had been built on being ahead of the game, on seeing the moves before they were made. And now, as she sat in the golden glow of the evening sun, she could already see the storm coming. Maddox would come for her, but she would be ready. The next morning, Maddox received the files he had requested. A thick manila envelope was dropped on his desk, its contents heavy with the weight of information. He tore it open eagerly, his fingers trembling with anticipation as he spread the documents out in front of him. There were financial records, business dealings, personal history. It was all there, laid out in black and white. But as Maddox began sifting through the documents, his excitement quickly turned to frustration. There was nothing. No criminal records, no hidden scandals, no shady business dealings. Leila Stewart's life was impeccably clean. She was, by all accounts, exactly who she claimed to be, a successful businesswoman with a pristine public image. Maddox slammed his fist down on the desk, his frustration boiling over. "Damn it," he snarled under his breath. How could someone like her, someone so arrogant, so smug, be so clean? It didn't make sense. But then, as he flipped through the pages again, something caught his eye. A single name, buried deep in the financial records, attached to a series of transactions that seemed out of place. It wasn't much, just a small thread, but to Maddox, it was enough. He leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face as he stared at the name on the page. "Got you," he whispered to himself, his heart pounding with the thrill of the chase. The name was Raphael Cortez, a notorious businessman with ties to several criminal organizations. If Leila was involved with someone like Cortez, it didn't matter how clean her record looked on the surface. Maddox knew he could use this connection to bring her down. Without wasting another moment, Maddox grabbed his phone and made another call. "I need a meeting with Raphael Cortez," he said, his voice brimming with newfound confidence. "And make it happen fast." Across town. Leila was already in the midst of her morning routine when her phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing slightly as she read the brief text, "Cortez is in play." She set the phone down, her mind racing. She had known this was coming, known that Maddox would dig, that he would find something, anything, to use against her. And now, it seemed he had latched onto the one connection that could be used to his advantage. Raphael Cortez. Leila had worked with Cortez years ago, back when she had first started building her business empire. He was ruthless, cunning and dangerous, the kind of man who thrived in the shadows. Their dealings had been brief, but they had left a mark on both of them. And now it seemed that Mark had come back to haunt her. She picked up the phone again, typing out a quick message to her contact in Cortez's organization. "We need to talk." Leela knew that if Maddox was bringing Cortez into the mix, things were about to escalate to a level she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about protecting her business anymore. It was about survival. Later that afternoon, Maddox sat in the dimly lit back room of a small bar on the outskirts of the city, his heart pounding with anticipation. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and whiskey, and the low murmur of conversation filled the room. He was waiting for Cortez, the man who would give him the ammunition he needed to bring Leela Stewart down. The door creaked open, and Maddox looked up to see Raphael Cortez step into the room. He was a tall, imposing figure, his sharp suit a stark contrast to the dingy surroundings. His eyes, dark and calculating, flicked over Maddox as he approached the table. "You asked for a meeting," Cortez said, his voice low and gravelly. "Here I am. What do you want?" Maddox didn't waste any time. "I need information on Leela Stewart. You've worked with her before. I want to know everything, every deal, every favor, every time she's bent the law. I know you have something on her." Cortez raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "And what makes you think I'd give that to you?" Maddox leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Because I can make it worth your while. You help me take her down, and I'll make sure you don't get caught in the crossfire. Leela Stewart is going down, one way or another. You can either be on the winning side, or you can go down with her." Cortez stared at Maddox for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he weighed his options. Then, slowly, a smile curled at the edges of his lips. "All right," he said, sitting down across from Maddox. "Let's talk." Meanwhile, Leela was already 2 steps ahead. She had expected Maddox to go after Cortez, and she had prepared for it. As the sun began to set over the city, she sat in her office, surrounded by her team of lawyers and strategists, plotting her next move. "We need to move fast," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "Maddox is getting desperate, and desperate men do dangerous things. We need to cut him off before he can use Cortez against us." Her team nodded in agreement, already mobilizing. They had dealt with situations like this before, but Leela could feel the urgency in the air. This wasn't just about outmaneuvering Maddox. This was about staying one step ahead in a game that had just taken a much darker turn. As Leela watched her team work, she felt a familiar sense of resolve settle over her. She had built her empire from the ground up, fighting every step of the way to get where she was. And she wasn't about to let Greg Maddox or Raphael Cortez take any of that away. The game was still in her hands, and as long as she was in control, she knew she could win. The atmosphere in Leila's penthouse was unusually still, a sharp contrast to the frenetic energy pulsing through the city below. Leela stood by the window, her eyes scanning the sprawling skyline, her mind churning with the countless contingencies her team had laid out over the past several hours. She had always been a master of strategy, but this situation was teetering on the edge of chaos. Raphael Cortez was the kind of man who thrived in unpredictability, and the fact that Maddox had reached out to him confirmed what Leela had suspected all along. Maddox was desperate, and desperate men rarely played by the rules. Her phone buzzed on the sleek glass table behind her, interrupting her thoughts. Without turning away from the window, she picked it up and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Nathaniel Clark. "We have a problem. Cortez is making his move." Leila's jaw tightened slightly. It had begun. She set the phone down calmly, although inside she could feel the heat of the impending confrontation. Cortez's involvement changed everything. His ruthlessness was unmatched, and she knew that if he had chosen to align himself with Maddox, It was because he saw an opportunity to exploit the situation for his own gain. But Leela was prepared. She had built her empire by anticipating moves before they happened, by knowing her opponents better than they knew themselves. Maddox and Cortez may have joined forces, but they had underestimated her. That was their first mistake. And it would be their last. At the same time, across the city in a dimly lit office, Maddox sat at a desk, his eyes darting between the documents spread out before him. He could feel the tension in the room, the weight of the plan he was about to set into motion. His meeting with Cortez had gone better than expected. Cortez had been more than willing to provide information on Leela, details about her past dealings, her connections, her weaknesses. Maddox now had everything he needed to take her down. But Cortez hadn't given him this information for free. No, there was always a price with men like him. And the price Cortez demanded was steep access to certain high-level clients that Maddox knew could be dangerous to involve. But Maddox didn't care anymore. He wanted to see Leela fall, and if that meant bending a few more rules, then so be it. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number Cortez had given him. "It's Maddox," he said when the line connected. "I'm ready to move." Cortez's voice on the other end was smooth, calm, and collected. "Good. We'll meet at the warehouse in an hour. Bring the documents. I'll handle the rest." Maddox hung up, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about Leela anymore. This was about proving to himself and everyone else that he still had power, that he still controlled the narrative. He grabbed the folder of documents detailing Leela's old business deals, the ones Cortez had flagged as suspect, and headed out of his office. An hour later, in the dim glow of a street lamp, outside an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts, Maddox pulled up in his car. The location was remote, chosen by Cortez for its discretion. The building loomed ominously in the darkness, a relic of the city's industrial past, now a place where shadowy deals were made under the cover of night. Maddox stepped out of the car, clutching the folder tightly in his hand. His eyes darted around the empty lot, his senses heightened with the awareness that he was walking into dangerous territory. Cortez wasn't the type of man you met without a contingency plan, but Maddox had no choice. He needed this deal to go smoothly if he was going to take Leela down. He approached the entrance to the warehouse, the heavy metal door groaning as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the walls covered in decades of grime and neglect. The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the room, and soon Cortez appeared, flanked by two of his men, tall, silent figures dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. "You've got the documents?" Cortez asked, his tone casual, but with an edge of expectation. Maddox nodded, holding up the folder. "It's all here. Every shady deal she's ever made. With this, we can make her look like a criminal in front of the world." Cortez smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Let's take a look." He reached for the folder, but Maddox hesitated for a fraction of a second, his instincts warning him that something wasn't right. But it was too late to back out now. He handed the folder over, watching as Cortez opened it and scanned the contents. Cortez's smile grew wider as he flipped through the pages. "This is good, Maddox. Real good. I think we're going to have a lot of fun with this." Maddox allowed himself a moment of relief. Finally, things were going his way. With Cortez's help, they could bury Leela under a mountain of legal trouble, ruin her reputation, and bring her entire empire crashing down. But just as Maddox started to relax, Cortez's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look. But here's the thing, Cortez said, closing the folder and tucking it under his arm. I don't need you anymore. Maddox blinked, confused. What are you talking about? Cortez's men moved forward, flanking Maddox on either side, their presence suddenly menacing. You see, Cortez continued, his tone casual but laced with danger. I've got everything I need right here. Your little grudge against Leela. That was useful to me. But now, you're just in the way. Maddox's heart began to race. Wait, what do you mean? We had a deal. Cortez chuckled softly, shaking his head. You're not in a position to make deals, Maddox. You were just a pawn. I'll take it from here. Before Maddox could react, Cortez's men grabbed him, forcing him down to his knees. Panic surged through his veins as he struggled, but it was no use. He had walked straight into a trap. What are you doing? Maddox shouted, his voice echoing through the empty warehouse. You need me. You can't do this without me. Cortez leaned down, his face inches from Maddox's. I've already done it, Maddox. You were just the bait. Leila's mine now. And with that, Cortez stood up, motioning to his men. They dragged Maddox toward the exit, his protests falling on deaf ears. As he was hauled away, Maddox realized too late that he had made a fatal mistake. In his obsession with taking Leela down, he had become the one being taken down. Back in her penthouse, Leela received the news she had been waiting for. Her contact within Cortez's organization had confirmed it. Maddox was out of the picture. He had underestimated Cortez's ambition, and now he was paying the price. Leela leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The threat from Maddox was over, but she knew that dealing with Cortez would require even more careful maneuvering. He was a far more dangerous opponent, one who operated in the shadows, where the rules didn't apply. But Leela wasn't worried. She had dealt with worse before, and she had always come out on top. This time would be no different. Her phone buzzed with a message from Nathaniel Clark. Maddox neutralized. Cortez is next. Leela smiled to herself. The game was far from over, but for now she had won another round. And as long as she remained one step ahead, she would keep winning. The night had fully fallen over the city by the time Leela Stewart received the final confirmation. She sat in her penthouse, the lights of the skyline glittering behind her as she read the message on her phone. It's done. Maddox is out. Cortez will come for you next. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. Maddox, in his desperation, had been dealt with. He had tried to outmaneuver her, tried to use the ruthless power of Raphael Cortez to his advantage, but in the end, it was his own greed and pride that led him to ruin. But now, Leela knew the real battle was about to begin. Cortez was a man who had survived by staying 2 steps ahead of everyone else. He thrived in chaos, in the grey areas of business where laws bent and power was fluid. Leela had worked with him before, back when she was building her empire, and she knew that he wouldn't hesitate to turn on her if he saw an opportunity. The fact that he had taken Maddox out of the equation only meant one thing now. He was setting his sights on her. She stood up from her chair, walking to the window, the cool glass reflecting the sharp lines of her face. Leela had anticipated this. She had always known that her path would lead her here to a final confrontation with a man who, like her, played the long game. But she wasn't afraid. She was prepared. Across the city, in a dimly lit office, Raphael Cortez sat at his desk, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of a glass of whiskey. His mind was racing, calculating his next move. Maddox had been useful, if only for a short time, but now he was a loose end that had been tied up. Leela Stewart, however, was a different matter entirely. He had underestimated her once, years ago, when they had first crossed paths in the world of high finance. Back then, she had been a rising star, someone with potential but still figuring out the game. Now, she was a force to be reckoned with. And that made her dangerous. Cortez took a sip of his drink, his eyes narrowing as he thought about their last conversation. Leela had always been strategic, careful in the way she dealt with him. But lately he had seen something different in her, a calm confidence that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. It was unsettling, even for a man like Cortez, who had built his empire on being unshakable. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. If Leela was making moves, he had to strike first. He picked up his phone, dialing a number. "Get the team ready," he said, his voice smooth but laced with tension. "We're going to pay Ms. Stewart a visit." Back in her penthouse, Leela was already moving. She had known that Cortez would make his move soon, and she had spent the last few hours making sure every possible scenario had been accounted for. Her team had been briefed, her security heightened, and most importantly, she had made a few strategic phone calls of her own. By the time Cortez's men were on their way to her, she was already several steps ahead. Her phone buzzed with a new message. "They're coming." Leela smiled slightly. Everything was going according to plan. She turned to Nathaniel Clark, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, reviewing documents on his tablet. "It's time," she said simply. Clark looked up, his expression calm but determined. "Everything's in place. Are you ready?" Leela nodded. "I've been ready." Less than an hour later, Cortez's convoy of black SUVs pulled up in front of Leila's building. The sleek vehicles, with their tinted windows and subtle menace, were a familiar sight in the darker corners of the city, but here, in the heart of the financial district, they stood out. Inside the lead car, Cortez sat in the back seat, his eyes scanning the building's entrance, looking for any signs of resistance. His men were efficient, slipping out of the cars and moving toward the building with quiet precision. They were professionals, the kind of men who handled situations like this without leaving a trace. But as they approached the lobby, something felt off. The air was too still, the streets too quiet. Inside the building, the concierge, a tall man in his 40s, looked up from his desk as Cortez's men approached. His expression didn't change. He had been expecting them. "Good evening," he said calmly, his voice smooth. "Ms. Stewart is waiting for you." The men exchanged glances, slightly unnerved by the lack of resistance, but they continued forward. As they stepped into the elevator, Cortez remained in the SUV, watching the building from behind the safety of the tinted glass. He didn't need to be there for this part. His men knew what to do. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the elevator doors closed behind his team, Cortez's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize. Checkmate. His heart skipped a beat. For the first time in a long time, Cortez felt a sliver of doubt creep into his mind. Upstairs, in her penthouse, Leela watched the security monitors as Cortez's men stepped off the elevator. They were met by her own team of security personnel, a group of highly trained professionals who had been briefed on every possible scenario. There was no need for violence. No need for confrontation. Leela had won before the game had even begun. As Cortez's men were escorted out of the building without incident, Leela turned to Nathaniel, who stood beside her, his arms crossed as he watched the monitors. "That was easier than I thought," Nathaniel remarked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Leela smiled, but there was no joy in it. "It's never easy with men like Cortez. But now he knows. He knows I'm not someone he can control. Nathaniel nodded. What happens next? Leela turned away from the monitors, walking back to the window. The city stretched out before her, a sea of lights and possibility. Now she said softly, we make sure he never gets another chance to come at me. The next morning, the city woke to the news that Raphael Cortez had been arrested. Details were scarce, but it was clear that someone had tipped off the authorities about his involvement in a series of high-profile criminal activities. His empire, built on secrets and shadows, was starting to crumble, and at the center of it all was Leela Stewart. She hadn't just neutralized the threat, she had dismantled it. As Leela sat in her office, reviewing the morning's headlines, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. She had played the long game, and she had won. But she knew that this victory wasn't the end. There would always be more threats, more enemies waiting in the shadows. Men like Maddox and Cortez were just the beginning. But Leela was ready. She had built her empire on foresight, on being the one who stayed 2 steps ahead. And as long as she remained in control, no one could take that from her. As she looked out over the city, her phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced at the screen and smiled. It was Nathaniel. Well played. Leela set the phone down, her smile fading into a look of steely determination. On to the next game, she whispered to herself, turning her attention to the next challenge on the horizon. Because for Leela Stewart, the game was never truly over.